We're going to talk about some of the Greek historians. Next slide, please. And how they also, this is also the director right here. Next slide. That gave that apology that I just mentioned. We're going to talk about the ancient Greeks. Because the Greeks were considered to be the most highly civilized people. Now we're going to ask ourselves again, either they were highly civilized or they were so dumb that they didn't know the color of the people that they were looking at. Because they described the ancient Egyptians very often. Herodias, who is considered to be the father of history. Here we go with this father of stuff again. Said that the ancient Egyptians were black-skinned and woolly-haired. He also said the Greek oracle was known to be from Egypt because she was black. That the narrative of the Nile blackens skin with heat. And the Egyptians are black-skinned and woolly-haired. Aristotle, I'm sure you've heard this name. He said the Ethiopians and the Egyptians are black. Here's his actual quote. He says, those who are too black, for instance, like the Egyptians and the Ethiopians, are cowards. And those who are excessively white are also cowards. But he said the complexion of courage lies in between the two. So here's what he was saying. He's saying Greeks were very similar to Italians, okay, in complexion. He said if you're too white, you're coward. And if you're too black, like the Ethiopians and Egyptians, you're a coward. But if you're in the middle, you got courage. So clearly, he saw the ancient Egyptians. Next slide, please. This is the Pharaoh Sennacherib. Obviously, judge for yourself. Was this an African? Next slide, please. Ammianus, Marcellinus. Okay, he wrote, the men of Egypt are mostly brown or black with a skinny, desiccated look. And this is his drawing of the ancient Egyptians, how he saw it. Again, are we going to trust dishonest scholarship? Even the Bible refers to the ancient Egyptians as the sons of Ham. Has anybody ever read that story? Some members of the dark races. The Ethiopians and the Egyptians were called Mizraim. Okay? They were considered to be all the dark races. Next slide, please. Here is Egyptian warriors. Next slide. Here are the Nubian warriors. When you take a look at them, you can see that they shared some culture. They even dressed very similar. The Nubians and the Egyptians, they were neighbors. Nubia would be modern-day Sudan, South Sudan. And just a few quotes that I'm going to mention from a professor at Oxford. He said, any characterization of race of the ancient Egyptians depends on the modern cultural definitions, not scientific study. Thus, by modern American standard, it is reasonable to characterize the ancient Egyptians as black while acknowledging the scientific evidence for physical diversity of all Africans. A British Africanist said this, whether the ancient Egyptians were black or brown, probably they were both. Their own artistic conventions painted some as pink, but the pictures on the tombs are often being married to queens who are entirely black from the south, while the Greek writers reported that they were much like other Africans who the Greeks knew. So by unanimous vote, the Greeks considered the ancient Egyptians to be black people. Next slide, please. As you can see, different complexions of African women. Okay, we talked about how it can go from blue-black all the way down to light skin. All diversity. Born and raised in Africa.
That's right.
Okay? So they started to have problems. Egypt started to have a problem on their hands. And the problem was, how are we going to continue up with this dishonest scholarship? So they came up with two definitions of two types of black people. You had the Hamite and the Negro. The Hamite is anyone with a slight narrow nose and slight straight hair, and anyone who did anything great in African civilizations. And they also happen to descend from Europeans. Then you had the Negroes, who are the real black people, who ain't did nothing but been a part of transatlantic slavery. So they created this facade of two different types of African people just to justify that one group created everything great, and the ones that are over here in America did nothing but be slaves. We have to ask ourselves, are we going to continue to agree with dishonest scholarship? Next slide, please. Black people, definition. This is Wikipedia talking here. Okay? It says black people is a skin-based classification used for specific people who are mid-dark brown complexion. Not all black people are dark-skinned, however, like I said earlier. However, in certain countries, it is often in social-based systems of racial classification in the Western world. And to go on further, it says, depending on the usage, it is mostly used for people of sub-Saharan African, okay, that's south of the Sahara, descendant of and also the indigenous people of Oceania, Southeast Asia, and the Indian subcontinent. So they're telling you it's not just black people in America. They're talking about sub-Saharan African. They're talking about the indigenous people of Oceania. They're talking about Southeast Asia and India as well. Are considered to be black people. Next slide, please. So, in 2015, there was a study conducted, again led by Professor Zahi Hawass. And the analysts turned out that they tested the family of King Tut and his family, and basically they came up with the idea that, well, 68% of his family was, 68% of their DNA was European, and the other half was Mediterranean. And very little, maybe 8%, sub-Saharan African. The problem with that particular DNA test is that they found inconsistencies in contamination in the DNA test. And guess what we found? The mixing of modern Egyptian DNA with ancient Egyptian DNA. Again, are we going to continue to trust dishonest scholarship? What are you doing mixing modern Egyptian DNA with ancient? What are you trying to prove? Are you trying to create a hybrid DNA? Yeah, it's a lie. Next slide. Okay, so in 2017, there was another way they wanted to try to do this. So they tested over 150 mummies, okay? And again, in this 150 mummy test, they were saying, we discovered they're 73% European now. This is 2 years after the first one. But guess what period these mummies were tested from? The Roman period. So it's very clear. And from a Roman burial site as well. So it's very clear why their DNA turned out 73% European. But they won't tell you this in the article. They'll tell you that we found the answer. Next slide, please. Sheka Anti-Diop. I'm sure some of you who are enlightened know a little bit about Sheka Anti-Diop, okay? Yeah. He was one of the African scholars who really went to set out to prove that ancient Egypt was a black civilization. He was considered an Afrocentric, and since then been debunked. He had many books, much proof, so many things. He asked to even test the pharaohs. He was denied the opportunity to test the melanin levels, as Miss Kathleen Richardson talked about earlier, melanin level. He was denied the opportunity to test the pharaohs. But he was allowed to test the common people of Egypt, and clearly they had the same DNA as those in sub-Saharan Africa. So now we're going to take the time, we're going to play another video from a Chinese professor who was trying to prove that his line, the Homo erectus, developed originally and didn't come from anywhere. So we're going to play video number 3, and let's see what he discovered or uncovered.
However, there is something that can settle this debate of where the Chinese come from once and for all. I'm meeting Professor Jin Li, one of China's leading geneticists. Recently, he led a project that set out to prove that the Chinese evolved independently from everyone else, from Homo erectus, here in China.
Before the project started, I was hoping that I could identify or could be able to find evidence that supports independent origin of Chinese in China, because I'm a Chinese and came from China, and through the education process, I always believed that there was something special about Chinese.
He singled out a male genetic marker which only appeared about 80,000 years ago in Africa. So any man who carries that marker must have recent African ancestors and can't be descended from the more ancient Asian Homo erectus. Jin took DNA from over 160 ethnic groups around East Asia. Over 12,000 samples. And so, what did you find?
We did not see even one single individual that could be considered as the descendant of the Homo erectus in China. Rather, everybody was a descendant of our ancestors from Africa.
The result couldn't have been any clearer. How did that make you feel as a Chinese person?
After I saw the evidences that we generated in my laboratory, I think we should all be happy with that, because after all, modern humans from different part of the world are not so different from each other, and we are very close relatives.
That's great, thank you.
Let's give a round of applause for that. As we saw there, that Chinese have uncovered their heritage. Okay? So this takes us into the Nubian region. And let's go to our next slide, please. All right. So, ancient Nubia, also known as Kush. They have 223 standing pyramids to this day. That predated Egypt, so they were before Egypt. Some believe the Egyptians got the pyramid building from them. Very similar customs, as we've seen the two warriors, the Nubian warriors and the Egyptian warriors, they look very similar. They were neighbors, so they definitely shared some of the same cultural values. Some of the pharaohs' names who ruled in the 25th dynasty: Taharka, Shabaka, Pai, Kashata. Okay, just to talk a little bit about Kush, because Kush was also one of the major influences in African history. We hear a lot about Egypt. Egypt wasn't all that happened in Africa. There's a lot more. Next slide, please. These are some of the pharaohs that ruled, like some of the ones I just mentioned from Kush. Next slide, please. This is in Benin, modern day the Edo state of Nigeria. This is the Great Wall. It is 4 times the size of the Chinese Wall. It is in the Guinness World Book of Records as the largest. Now here is just some of the industrious. It seems well governed, and theft is unknown because the people live in such security that they live without doors. Do we even see that on the east side of Buffalo? All right, here's another 17th century Dutch visitor. He said, the houses are built alongside the streets in order, one across from another, adorned with gables and steps. They are usually broad and long galleries inside, especially so that the case of houses of nobility, and divided into many rooms, which are separated by walls made with red clay, very well erected. He said the walls are shiny and smooth by washing and rubbing, while as in Holland, they are made with chalk. But these ones appear like mirrors. The upper stories are made in the same sort of clay, with the same sort of clay. Moreover, every house was provided a well to supply fresh water. Does that sound like a bush?
No, that's definitely civilization.
Mm-hmm. Right next door, we have the Europa. Next slide, please. This is the head of Ife. Currently, it's been taken to a British museum. The head of Ife was done with 18 different metal alloys. Africans were not known to be metallists. But here, you have a fine piece of art of 18 different metal alloys. These were the Yoruba people. Heard Miss Kathleen mention the Yoruba people earlier. This must have represented the king at the time. When the British discovered this, they took this to the British Museum. So this is no longer in Africa. Next slide, please. This church in Ethiopia was built in the 4th century. Now, if anyone knows about the Bible, the King James Version was written in the 1600s. This was the 4th century. Some consider this to be the first Christian church after the apostle times. This church was dug 230 feet into the surface. We talking mud huts now? Next slide, please. Here we have the supposed king of Mali. National Geographic. Mansa Musa. That look like Mansa Musa to y'all? Here's what it says. It says, the ruler of West African land of Mali came into power in the 1300s. Let's see how it probably really would look. Next slide. And he controlled most of West Africa. And if anybody ever heard of Timbuktu? A lot of people think Timbuktu was a made-up place. I thought that as well. But in his pilgrimage, Mansa Musa, in his pilgrimage to Mecca, he gave away $90 million in gold. This man was worth $500 billion in gold. Still talking mud huts? So the Mali region, next slide, please. This is Mansa Musa again. He has a solid gold globe in his hand. That's how much gold this man had. Next slide, please. This was the first mosque in Mali. Next slide. As you can see, that would be the region of Mali on what they control. Next slide. And now we're going to talk about Carthage. This is the European depiction of Hannibal Barca. Has anybody ever heard of Hannibal? He is considered to be the greatest warrior that resisted and nearly brought Rome to his knees. We're going to see if this is how we really look. Next slide, please. Those coins here represented the true face of Hannibal Barca. Look at the coins. And as you see, when Hannibal Barca went to war, he traveled with trumping elephants, as you see in the back of the coin. So, National Geographic says, we got to correct this, finally. Not National Geographic, the History Channel. The History Channel released this. Let's give them a hand clap for that. Next slide, please. This was also a depiction of Hannibal Barca. I'll give him some credit for that as well. Next slide, please. We have Ishaka Zulu, Shaka Senakanoza. Okay, that means Shaka, son of Senakanoza. These happen to be my ancient ancestors. As you see, the name Kulu is derived from Zulu, from the Bantu tribe. Okay? Shaka Zulu started ruling his regiment in around the time of the 1700s, late 1700s, 1787, and he ruled, I believe it was 1801 to 1828 when he died. He was assassinated by his own brother. Shaka Zulu created a new spear, a new form of warfare. These warriors used to take spears, one on this side, one and the enemy on the other side, and they would throw spears back and forth. And whenever they got tired, whoever got tired would win that war. Shaka Zulu said, no, we ain't doing that anymore. We're going to engage the enemy. This is how Shaka Zulu changed warfare. He made a short spear called the Nkwa. And why do you call it the Nkwa? Because when it goes inside your side, it says, Nkwa, Nkwa. And rip it out of you. That's what Shaka Zulu did. Next slide, please. Now, controversial part. African presence in ancient America. They came before Columbus. This is written by Ivan Van Sertima. He has also been considered to be an Afrocentric. But we're going to see if we have proof. We're going to watch a 13-minute video. Please be patient because it's very informative to learn about your African roots in the Americas. Yeah.
Right, and then lock the doors because what I'm about to say is going to upset some people right next here. Okay. Christopher Columbus did not discover America. Exactly. I mean, never mind the question of how you can discover a place where the inhabitants are watching you arrive from the shore. There are actually many other mariners before Columbus that discovered America as well, decades earlier, even eons earlier. But it's only been in the last century that evidence has surfaced and continually grown to indicate that many of these pre-Columbers might have come from Africa. So the first scientist to promote this possibility was Leo Wiener. Born in Russia, Wiener immigrated to the United States in the late 19th century on his way to British Honduras, where he planned to open a vegetarian commune. Well, when that turned out not to be the dream job he expected, he moved back to the United States and he became a professor at Harvard University, as one does. But in his time in Mesoamerica, he started noticing things. There are lots of things that made him consider if the origins of American civilization might actually be in Africa. So he observed so many linguistic and botanical and other similarities that between 1920 and 1922, he published an extensive 3-volume piece called Africa and the Discovery of America. Now, unfortunately, this is the 1920s, so as yet, no serious archaeological work had been done to support his botanical theories, because everyone was overrating tombs in Egypt and things like that. He didn't have a whole lot of other stuff than the names to support him. However, he knew that other clues must exist. For example, he pointed out that Columbus himself was aware that African mariners had preceded him. In his diary of his second voyage, Columbus tells of how the natives of Hispaniola actually had given him gold-tipped metal spearheads that they said were brought by black-skinned people who had come in large boats from the south and southeast. So upon returning to Spain, is that he actually took the spearheads and he sent them away and they had them assayed, and it turned out to be that these spearheads were covered in this alloy that the inhabitants called guanin. The metallurgists actually found out that this was an alloy of 32 parts, 18 of gold, 6 of silver, 8 of copper, which, dun dun dun, matched the metal used in spearheads made in Western Africa, as carried by medieval African warriors, including the Mali and the Moors. The West Africans even called this metal guanine, the same name used by the natives of Hispaniola. But nothing more was said about that. Conspiracy. Well, probably because it was in their best interest that they didn't want to have any challenges to their discovery and the claims to the islands of the West Indies. Well, as the poem goes, or it should anyway, in 1493, Columbus stole all he could see. Yeah, so on the second voyage, which was 10 times larger than the first, Columbus went on a frantic but unsuccessful island hopping trip to find gold and spices. He carried along several natives from his newly discovered San Salvador, which the inhabitants called Guanahanvi. Another island that the natives pointed out was called Soameto. Soameto. Now, Columbus continued going around whimsically renaming every island he could find, but Leo Wiener, being the curious person and the linguist that he was, and the etymologist, he couldn't help noticing that the origin of these many place names and botanical names in Mesoamerica actually sounded distinctly like other languages in Africa, particularly Bantu and even Arabic. Wiener and numerous other botanists have also puzzled over the presence of certain plants that predated Columbus but originated in Africa. For example, the calabash bottlegourd. Now, this is a species originally from West Africa, where they were well cultivated in America before Europeans arrived, even long before they existed in Indonesia or Polynesia. How certain plants, such as the yam, the sweet potato, domesticated cotton, peanuts, and tobacco, reached both West Africa and the Americas. The spread of the plantain is particularly noteworthy because it could not remain viable if it was carried in salt water. Well, in the 1640s, the Brazilian botanist George Marquet wrote that the establishment of particular varieties of plantains in this region stands as a strong argument for ancient maritime contact between the Americas and Africa. That's bananas! So how do these plants and languages and other cultural elements get to the Americas? Well, some people believe that over thousands of years, Africans migrated out of Africa, then over the Bering Strait, then down into South America. Another explanation exists. There you go, let it out of your system. Awesome. Africans had ships. In fact, they had 4 kinds. They had a shipload of vessels. And this is an example of Nubian pottery with a painting on it that shows either a long-hauled boat or a papyrus raft or a hulled-out canoe. And this is a bird's eye view of an oared riverboat in Chad, and it dates from 3500 BCE. The Africans of Guinea also had dugout canoes, hewn from these monumental trees on the coast there. In 1500, which was just a few years after Columbus's voyage, the Portuguese captain Pacheco Pereira wrote, "In this country can be found the largest canoes, made of a single trunk. Some are so large that they hold 80 men." Here's a 15th century Portuguese painting of sailing canoes on the Congo estuary. The Portuguese, like Captain Pereira, had heard that African traders were visiting Brazil in the mid-1400s. So to demonstrate that mariners from West Africa could have sailed to the Americas using papyrus vessels as early as 2000 BCE, the Norwegian adventurer Tor Heyerdahl actually used ancient shipbuilding techniques in order to construct and sail the Ra 1 and the Ra 2 in 1969 and 70. And generally, some type of sailing vessel will average about 100 miles per day. Islamic historian Amir Hajib reported that voyages west from Mali were happening in the year 1311, just 150 years before Columbus. Now, when he asked the Mali emperor, shown here, incidentally, holding a globe of the world made of solid gold, he asked him, well, tell me about this rumor about Atlantic travel. And he said that his predecessor had commissioned an expedition with 200 ships filled with men, and a similar number with gold and water and enough provisions for 2 years. And he said, don't come back till you find something or you run out of food. And unfortunately, only one ship returned, and the captain told the emperor that we sailed for a very long time until we met with what seemed like a river with a strong current flowing in the open sea. And I turned where I was and did not enter the current. The others disappeared. I do not know what became of them. So, well, this story seems to describe the trade wind-driven equatorial current, or the Canary Current. We basically have two rivers, two circular rivers in the ocean here, and you can see it's very easy for Africans from the south and the Angola regions to come up towards the equator, going westwards, or from the western coast of Africa, north of the equator, to go along that same current. This Mercator projection doesn't do it justice, so I did this little animation for you to show that they could have taken the Canary Current up and around, and then they go over they fall off the edge of the earth, and then they come back and they make landfall back again in Cape Verde. So it is definitely possible. At least a dozen explorers, including Constantine Ravenous, reported seeing blacks upon reaching the New World. In fact, in 1513, Spanish explorer Vasco Núñez de Balboa, when Balboa was there, he said he met members of a tribe of Ethiopians in Panama. And according to Balboa's log, these men came from a totally black village that was 2 days' journey away. And he figured that these blacks had come from Ethiopia at a much earlier date. So there are also examples of physical evidence, including pre-Columbian African skeletons, which have been found throughout the Americas. Now, dating between 800 BCE and 300 CE, these murals are from the Temple of the Warriors at Chichen Itza. Now, they clearly feature three races. It's depicting black and Indian allies and a battle against white invaders. Now, because of their long blonde hair jewelry, a skin-hulled boat right there, and also the fact that they're fighting naked, which was common for warriors from Ireland, they believe that these are Celtic warriors. And because this mural shows that blacks are clearly fighting on the side of the Mayans, that they must have been integrated into that society much longer before this painting was done in order to form that form of alliance. There are numerous pre-Columbian figurines with striking similarities to ancient African artwork, and they've been found in Central and South America. Southeastern Mexico, there are 18 rock statues of heads up to 11 feet tall that are facing the ocean, looking east. Now, archaeologists call them the Olmec colossal heads, after the people that carved them, and they were produced for 50 to 200 years and date from at least 900 BCE, when they were mysteriously buried for some reason. So now think about it. It took enormous effort to quarry these, the smallest one was 6 tons, so 6 to 50 ton blocks, to quarry them and carry them 75 miles away from the quarry, and then carve them and then erect them. These people that they modeled them after must have been important. Whoever they were, they must have been important to be remembered or obeyed or worshipped. Well, Jose Meglio Serrano, the archaeologist who first uncovered them, he pointed out that facial features look amazingly like African blacks, and they all display distinctive headgear or protective helmets. Now, however, some people think that these are actually the facial figures of overweight babies.
No.
Yeah, I think they needed to wear helmets when they were babies if they did that. So. And then still others find it easier to believe that instead of Africans, those depicted or responsible for these sculptures, and as well as the Mesoamerican pyramids, were not African Americans, but dun dun dun.
Aliens.
So why is it that so many people have never heard of this alternative of American discovery by the continent's nearest neighbor? Look at how close this is. I mean, white people don't think that you could go this is closer compared to more than twice the distance that Columbus sailed. Very few Americans know this, and why is it? So having examined textbooks for years, up until 2018, James W. Lowen says that although some books cite the alternative possibility that Vikings, Norse, or even Irish may have reached America first, not one textbook, old or new, mentions the West African. It's obvious that Columbus was not the first to discover America, but the last. Why did he make such an indelible mark on Western people's minds? Well, conquest may have a lot to do with it. Right, Eurocentrism. And also, unlike the mundanity of perhaps thousands of years of peaceful African transatlantic trade, the quest for gold and world domination makes a much better story. And, the good Queen Isabella was so proud of her fella that she immediately equipped Columbus with 17 ships, 1,500 men, 200 cannons, crossbows, cavalry, and even 20 attack dogs for his second voyage. And another, and another. The story of Columbus remains the most widely accepted version of American discovery, most likely because it was the most recent, the most well-armed, the most documented, and the most similar in appearance to the authors of American textbooks. And one other thing that should be pointed out here is that in the years after Columbus discovered America, in 400 years, 20 million Africans were stripped from the coast of Africa, half of them dying in transit for slavery, who knows how many fleeing inland. And at the same time, within 5 years of Columbus's arrival in the New World, 90% of the indigenous population had died from disease or murder, 90%. So the fact is that leaves few people to have a written or memory or an oral history of the seafaring of their African discoverers.
Let's give a round of applause for Dan Van Doren. Okay, so we've seen that even now, there is much more room for improvement in our school curriculums. Would you agree?
Oh, yeah.
None of this stuff is being taught to the youth. Talk about that group esteem. Okay? Why am I pushing to try to get this taught to our youth? Again, when I was at this conference that was here this Wednesday, I'm pretty sure most of them knew none of this information. Most of the African Americans knew none of this information. The miseducation of black Africans has to do a lot with them even questioning their own beauty. Samuel A. Cartwright, an American physician, in 1851, he came up with a mental illness called drapetomania, which was supposed to be for slaves fleeing slavery. So they had diagnosed any slave who was fleeing slavery, including Harriet Tubman, with this mental illness. So to want to be free was considered a mental illness. And this was accepted in 1851.
Repeat that term again.
Drapetomania is D-R-A-P-E-T-O-M-A-N-I-A. And his name is Samuel A. Cartwright, if you want to check those references. Let's go to our next slide, please. All right, as we see, we're going to go through these quick slides. And these slides basically tell us of what we see, some of the reflection that we see today. As you see here, this was in Egypt. You see the cross now. Next slide. This is on the seal on the back of the dollar bill. As you take a look there, the great symbol of Kemet, the eagle of Horus. Next slide. Ah, the Washington Monument, the old Bleak. You can see the similarities. Next slide. This was the first depiction of Jesus and the apostles. Does it look like this now? Next slide. And let's give a warm shout out to DreamWorks for actually getting it right. I spoke earlier about Professor Leakey, and I'm going to play my last clip 6, okay? And National Geographic is actually coming around, guys. They're coming around. We talked about some of the false things they did, but I want to show you, we talked about Lucy was discovered by Professor Leakey, but now we're going to see, from a biblical standpoint, how Adam may have looked.
Now Frank Bender can show us what he might have looked like. His goal is not just to sculpt, but to reveal his personality.
I tried to get into his head just like I would a fugitive. Intuition is the binder between art and science. It's the part that pulls it all together and gives it that life, that spark. I picture him very much alive and with a lot of the basic feelings that we have today. Confidence at one point, insecurity at another.
Finally, Wells comes face to face with the man he's been searching for. A new portrait of the common ancestor of every man today. Adam. Without the skull, we can't know for sure what Adam looked like. But a combination of genetic evidence, Bender's forensic skills, and cutting-edge computer software suggest he looked something like this. Thousands of years after the Bible, and hundreds of years after Michelangelo, we have a whole new face for Adam.
I like the expression. He's got a very forceful look.
He's intent on something, maybe taking over the world. You begin to get perhaps an insight into why these guys went out and why this guy's our ancestor.
Science can't tell for sure what set Adam apart. There were other men who lived alongside him, But over the centuries, all the other men's lines died out. Maybe some had only daughters, or no children at all. Their Y chromosomes were lost forever. Only Adam's lineage survives.
All right, let's give a round of applause for National Geographic for that one, y'all. So as you can see, that even whether it's science, the Bible, the Quran, they all have one agreement. Whether it's 6,000 years ago, 600,000 years ago, 6 million years ago, however they may predict these times, they all say out of the Africa movement. Everything in every nation, every civilization developed out of Africa. They all agree on that. So, if we're going to be a part of change, the first thing we have to do is fight to get this into our school curriculums.
That's right. Yep.
Again, this does not just restore pride to Africans. This restores truth to all people, that all people derive from Africa. And if we continue to degrade Africa as a society, to steal from Africa, Africa supplies 48% of the resources to the world. 48%. That's almost half. They might as well have just said 50%. So if we continue to degrade Africa, then we are simply degrading ourselves. Thank you.